everyone. Thank you for joining this event on the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor during a time of war. I'm Allison Miner, the Director for the Project on Middle East Integration here at the Atlantic Council. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most significant arteries for global commerce, has effectively been on pause for a month as a result of the Iran war, driving up prices for oil, fertilizer, aluminum, and other goods. Even as we welcome last night's news of a ceasefire, Iran continues to assert their control over shipping through the strait, creating continued uncertainty for global commerce. This is not the first time that conflict has upended global maritime shipping in recent years. Between 2023 and 2025, the Houthis' Red Sea campaign also jeopardized shipping through another critical waterway that carries 15% of global trade. This instability creates both a threat and an opportunity for trade and energy corridors in the Middle East. The threats drive home the importance of strategic redundancy in global commerce, lessons that the world started to learn during the COVID-19 pandemic and the 2021 Ever Given incident that shut down shipping through the Suez Canal. In 2023, leaders from India, the Middle East, and Europe came together along with the United States and signed on to the idea of the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, in part because of these lessons. IMEC incorporates a trade corridor that connects rail and maritime routes and mitigates regulatory barriers, an energy corridor that strengthens power interconnections and renewable energy supply chains, and a digital corridor that can address the bottlenecks that exist in global cables through the Middle East. IMEC, unlike the Belt and Road, is based on a decentralized approach that stitches together a series of existing bilateral and national initiatives and private sector projects into a broader corridor. This decentralized approach is both a source of strength and a source of weakness. Because most of these projects are already progressing and being financed through various means, it makes the corridor a much more manageable initiative. It also facilitates a modular approach that permits simultaneous progress on different components of the corridor, even if others may face challenges. But the decentralized approach also means that missing links, such as the absence of a functional freight rail line in Jordan, can impede the overall capacity of the corridor. And it also makes regulatory and technical harmonization, which are essential to the success of the trade corridor, that much more difficult. The IMEC governments have signed on to a Sherpa process to coordinate the trade, energy, and digital corridors, and that process is continuing as we speak. To understand how IMEC is being impacted by the current instability in the Middle East and whether or not it can provide a source of strategic redundancy that is so needed in the global economy today, we have brought together three experts from across the globe. First, we have Afaq Hussain. Afaq is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a leading expert on IMEC. He directs the Bureau of Research on Industry and Economic Fundamentals based in New Delhi, and he specializes in logistics infrastructure, trade facilitation, and regulatory processes. Second, we have Dr. John Sfakianakis. Dr. Sfakianakis is the chief economist and head of economic research at the Gulf Research Center, based in Saudi Arabia. He is also a senior scholar at the University of Cambridge. He has served as a senior investment strategist and economic advisor in government, multilateral institutions, and at major international firms. Finally, we have Mohammed Soleiman. Mohammed is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and a director at McLarty Associates in Washington, D.C. He is the author of the book, West Asia, A New American Grand Strategy in the Middle East. He is an engineer by training and an expert on technology, finance, and energy. On behalf of the Atlantic Council, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of our panelists. I will start the event by asking a couple of questions to each panelist before opening up to questions online from our audience. For our audience, please submit those questions via our Ask AC platform online. You can see the link here. First, Afaq, I'd like to turn to you. Could you speak to how you think IMEC can provide strategic redundancy for energy and trade routes, and if there are specific projects along the corridor that you think are most important for that strategic redundancy?
Thank you, Alison. Thank you for having me here. I think first of all, congratulations to all of us for the ceasefire that was announced a few hours back. I think at this time we are at the cusp of new structures of logistics, which will involve movement of goods, as well as energy. And that's very important. And IMEC comes at a time when we're all looking what happened in the last few weeks, or rather few years. I mean, for the last 4 to 6 weeks, we have seen what has been happening at the Strait of Hormuz, how difficult it was to move cargoes and energies, almost, if not blocked. And then if we go back 2 years, 2.5 years, we could see what happened in this in the Red Sea crisis as well. So there has been a challenge across this whole Middle East in terms of moving goods as well as energy, and that's where IMEC came into picture. And IMEC came as Plan B. I mean, I would still call it Plan B because Plan A will always be my maritime route. So because of capacities, costs, and efficiencies. So that's where this IMEC came as Plan B, and it came as a plan which would help us serve these crises. And all along when IMEC was announced, since IMEC has been announced, we've all been talking about, oh, it's going to come handy when we have crisis. It will come handy when we might see Strait of Hormuz blocked. And we saw it. And this is why IMEC was being talked about all along. This was the whole purpose of IMEC, to address the crisis that we are facing for the last 6 weeks. And I think we have tested the concept. I mean, that the logic was right. You need alternatives for crisis. And today it was Hormuz, tomorrow it will be something else in some part of the world. So we need these alternatives for movement of goods as well as energy. And talking about IMEC, some of the key projects which are really important, and we have seen, and over the last few weeks, we have seen businesses, logistics companies, governments finding their own alternative routes to carry goods within the Gulf region. And if you look at that, there are certain critical projects, infrastructural projects that are going to be important. One is the Saudi Jordan railway line, because that's the backbone of your IMEC, the railway line. Yes, there are road already existing, cargo moving, but to increase the efficiency of this corridor, you would need railway. So there is Saudi Jordan railway line, which is in progress, which needs to be built. Then there is a complete missing link of railway line in Jordan. We do not have any railway line in Jordan. That's another important project which is needed to make this operational. Then there is, I mean, if you look at widening the scope of IMEC, go beyond UAE and get into Oman, you have Hafid Rail, which is already been talked about. Again, a $3 billion project, which will enhance the capacity of GCC moving into Saudi Arabia, and then other relevant ports in Israel, or some other ports also. Like there are conversations that we would want to widen the network of IMEC, as we call it, the network of corridors. And then that opens a whole new infrastructural projects which would go up to Syria, the Syrian ports of Latakia, the Syrian port of Tartus, where already some. So, but if you talk about the core IMEC corridor from UAE to Haifa, I think a critical project is the railway line that we need, and port capacity expansion in Israel, which is at this time before the war. I'm talking. I mean, we don't know what is the situation post the war. Before the war, it was 1.5 million, and I think that needs to be enhanced, that capacity. So those are the key projects. And when it comes to India, I mean, India is up there in terms of port infrastructure. We have really good port infrastructure on our western ports, whether it is Jawaharlal Nehru Port Trust or it is Mundra Port. So the infrastructure to handle cargo for IMEC is there, and the immediate next partner for India is UAE. Again, a historical corridor, good connectivity, really good. We have a free trade agreement also in place. So that is more or less sorted. And then on the European side, we have three key ports, which is Paris. Then you have Trieste and Marseille. Some capacity expansion needed, in particularly in Paris and Trieste. Marseille, a more developed. And the positive thing about that part is that the railway connectivity from ports to the rest of Europe is in place. So that's how the IMEC corridor looks like as an option B. I would always call it as option B. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Afak. I really appreciate you mapping out the current status of the corridor, where those missing links are, and how close we are to having a really solid plan B during this period of uncertainty. John, I'd like to turn next to you. The Iran war is having a significant impact on Gulf economies, and I'm curious if you see it impacting the Gulf commitment to some of these key projects associated with IMEC, whether it's completing these missing links in Gulf and Jordanian rail, port expansions, or on the energy side on renewable energy expansion and HVDC connections to Europe.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be with you, and congratulations to Mohammed for his book. It's not an easy task, and congratulations to the world for beginning to end the war. Sometimes I'm questioning why the war began if we have winners, both of them being winners, but that's a different question. I would say that to try and redirect a lot of its funding into the new defense environment and the new thinking that goes around the future of the Gulf in a post-war, post-Iran, Israel-US war. And I think that will redirect a lot of their attention towards that effort and endeavor. But it also puts into question what exactly are the priorities of the Gulf. And I think now they would need to double down on these priorities of diversification. I don't think there is a way out of the vision to the post-oil economies. And I think this is the direction. The funding is very important because IMEC has certain obligations and duties, and somebody needs to build the railroad. And also the connectivity between the Gulf states, the GCC states, but also between Saudi Arabia and Jordan. And the question is, who builds the Jordanian railroad? Saudi Arabia certainly can contribute towards that, but others will need to cover for the gap. Is not in the best shape and hasn't been so for quite a long time. I think also it puts into question how do we deal with the energy leverage that IMEC is going to be asking, meaning that we need to think of not just the infrastructure, but also like hydrogen exports, alternative routes to the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia is geographically well placed to do that. But IMEC is a facilitator of some of these routes, and we could actually enhance the debate and the narrative that goes into IMEC. Electricity grids and how that enhances IMEC is very important. Afak spoke about cables. Cables is a fundamental part of that. And also the connectivity between Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula with the Eastern Mediterranean. Saudi Arabia has excellent relations with Greece. The port of Piraeus is an excellent point to put those strategies into place. But then we need to think of pricing. Will the cargo that goes through the Arabian Peninsula and Saudi Arabia, will it be well priced in order to be competitively priced versus vessels and dry bulk carriers, or we're still stuck with the strait? Or do we use as an alternative Jeddah Islamic Port, Yambu in the case of the East-West pipeline, or NEOM as an alternative to the other two? And do we look forward as a facilitator of IMEC through the alternatives that Saudi Arabia offers? One thing for sure is after this crisis, Saudi Arabia needs to work and the rest of the GCC together as one unit. I think the whole discussion about frenemies and the differences of opinion and who has diversified more and less needs to be put aside, and then think how within this new Gulf security the GCC, Saudi Arabia, can work together. IMEC should not be singling out one or two participants. It should enclose all the countries in the GCC, Bahrain, Kuwait. Yes, they're not immediately into the center of IMEC, but what do we lose by including Oman and Kuwait, who sit on two different ends of the Gulf? And that should be very important because in these challenging times, what we've learned again, supply is an issue. Supply chains are very important. And IMEC is trying to address the issue of supply. And I think more GCC Gulf unity is required as we move forward in this post-war scenario.
Thanks so much, John. I think your comments really drive home the importance of Saudi Arabia in this whole endeavor, both geographically where they sit, but also the existing infrastructure that they have, whether it's with Jeddah Port, with Yanbu Port, the East-West pipeline, their investments in green hydrogen and NEOM. But I very much also appreciate your point that no single country can be embarking on these missing links alone, and the value of how IMEC can nest within a more integrated Gulf approach to the region after this war. Mohammed, I'd like to turn to you next. Your ambitious new book really talks about how the U.S. needs to be changing its approach to the Middle East, or as you call it, West Asia. And I'd be curious how you see the Iran war shaping how the U.S. government sees IMEC and its priorities for the corridor.
Thank you, Alison. It's a pleasure to be with you. I hope that I can be optimistic about the discourse of the ceasefire. We'll see how this is going to unfold in the next few weeks. To your question, and what I try to tell in my book is that the borders that used to separate the Indian Ocean, Mediterranean Sea no longer exist. And I think this war confirms the thesis on the security side, on the economic side, on the strategic side. From the security side, the very idea that you have Korean air defense systems in the UAE, you have French Rafale over the skies of the Gulf, confirms the thesis that you have a different region with different players that's much more expensive than the old definition of the Middle East. B, and this is important on the economic side, it also confirms the thesis that the Gulf has risen as this nerve center of global economy. Not only crude, it's helium, it's a source of capital as capital allocators, it is the aviation role they play, all these Gulf lines that carry all these passengers from Europe to Asia. It's the role that they play on the natural gas side as logistical hub. So clearly their own positioning as a strategic nerve center for this Eurasian rimland system was on display during this war, during this crisis. So what does it mean for America? I argue in my book that America needs to change the way it sees the region as a transnational, transcontinental region. You need to build architecture. And I think given the fact that you're going to have the regime in Tehran staying, entrenched regime in Tehran, this is no longer a controversial statement. This is clearly a reality. You need a day after strategy. And this day after strategy will have to be order building. You have to bring different coalitions. You have multiple coalitions that I propose in the book. One is about security, which is clearly the most important one, and one on techno-economic integration. So let me focus on this for the sake of this conversation. I'm not going to repeat what my colleagues on the panel have said about redundancy, building alternatives, because all of this is true. But clearly you're going to have GCC-wide initiatives, but you're also going to have initiatives that are country-specific. What's good for the UAE in terms of maritime connectivity, the Saudis might be much more interested in a Red Sea pivot in terms of the infrastructure. I lived in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, so I know the city very well. I have seen the development in Jeddah, in Yanbu. Those are cities that I visited. There's a massive Saudi push to reorient its own economy as a Red Sea state. So they will act as a backbone for the rest of the GCC. This will be part of their positioning. The UAE will be still much more focused on maritime connectivity and building on the partnership that they have with South Asia, specifically with India and ASEAN. On the broader view of some of the initiatives that we have, like IMEC, I am not sure. I am not saying that this is the end of IMEC. I'm not saying that. I am saying you're going to have so many new initiatives that are going to work together side by side, and this is good, and make all of them successful. Because I believe that the volume of trade and servicing is so massive that we have underserviced logistics systems, and we need to build those. You will see a new role for Syria under the new government in Damascus. You will see much more of a Saudi, Jordan, Syria, Gulf to Levant emerging trade corridor that will be centered around the reconstruction of Syria as a state. You will see GCC, Saudi, Red Sea pivot, and much more different relationship with the Europeans, specifically through Yanbu, Jeddah, or in the north in Syria, or through the Suez Canal. You will see a different dynamic when it comes to South Asia. The question of India, the question of Pakistan around trade, specifically with Saudi and Pakistan, Saudi and the UAE. And I think the G20 summit in Miami this year will be important because you're going to have the Sherpa meeting around IMEC, and then we'll get a flavor of how the administration thinks about IMEC post-Iran. They clearly recognize that the very idea would not have alternatives, that everything was very much hinged on the Hormuz Strait is absolutely disastrous. And the security posture that we have right now is not sustainable. Therefore, you have to embrace different sort of logistic systems that's integrated with a strategy of order building that Washington has to pursue. Will the administration pursue that? That's a question, and I will leave this to officials to show us how they think about the day after.
Thanks so much, Mohammed. I think your point really drives home. The world was already changing before the IMEC initiative was announced in September 2023, talking about some of the shifting orientations of major Gulf players. But the world has changed so much since then when you think about the Gaza war, Syria's transition, and now the Iran war. And the imperative really is for IMEC to adapt in response to those changes and be part of this evolution in global shipping and maritime commerce. Afaq, I'd like to build on what Mohammed was just saying about how the U.S. might shift its approach. We know that the IMEC signatory government Sherpa process has continued amid this regional turbulence, and that they'll actually be meeting again on the sidelines of the IMF World Bank spring meetings here in D.C. next week. I'm curious how you think that coordination process needs to evolve in response to the Iran war.
I think one of the positives in the last couple of years since it was announced was the continuity in the Sherpa meetings. I mean, we were hearing the meetings are happening. I mean, so that was one of the positives. And with the conflict that recently happened in the last 6 weeks, there is a need to reorient the structure of the conversation now. The structure of IMEC that way. There are three key pillars that we need to come up with, which is one is about the inclusivity, which is taking on from the point what Mohammed was talking about. There would be more lines, more countries part of it, and we need to look into that. We need to look into countries like Syria. We need to look into countries like Oman. And the advantage that Oman gives is Oman is outside the Strait of Hormuz, and the ports like Salalah, which has 4.5 million capacity of container handling. And then you go into Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has two really good ports, which is Neom Port as well as Jeddah Islamic Port. We need to utilize those more as part of, because as John was talking about, that there's huge cargo which is available to be moved. I mean, that's there's no shortage of cargo. You will fall shortage of routes, but you will not fall short of cargo. So the more countries are part of these corridors, the more networks we create, it gives us two economic benefits. One is that you will be able to handle more capacities. In our previous report, which we released at Atlantic Council last year, we said that IMEC will be able to handle 1.5 million containers a year. which is nothing in terms if you look at what the global trade is all about or what the trade within this region is all about. So that 1.45 with more countries, with more infrastructure utilization can translate into 3, 4, 5 million TUs with time if you make the relevant infrastructure development with these countries. The other is when you have more options, the question of pricing comes into play. And we might be offered some better pricing mechanisms, which John was talking about, that pricing is going to be a question mark. And that takes me to the next point, which is the practicality. So the conversations also need to revolve around the practicality aspect, which is about eventually you have to move cargo, you have to move energies, and you need to make it practical for the businesses to be done. That's where the pricing, the harmonization, the efficiencies, all those are the governance structure of IMEC comes into play. The testing agencies, the customs, the terminal operators, all those need to be aligned. And while some countries within this whole group have bilateral agreements, which will definitely come in handy, a lot of them do not have. If I take, for example, India has recently signed a free trade agreement with European Union. That adds up. Free trade agreement with UAE, with Oman. All this adds up. But then there are so many countries involved. It's not going to be that easy to get everyone on board, come on a common platform to ensure the efficiency, which is about the practicality of the thing. So that's point number 2. Point number 3, which we have all seen, is the security. The conversations among the Sherpas also needs to look at the security, because that's again very important factor for any businesses, whether it is government trading energies or whether it is a private businessman exchanging containers. We need security of the cargo. So that's going to be an important element given what has been happening over the last few weeks and few years. So conversations need to happen that, in particular, countries like Jordan, very vulnerable in terms of security threat. Syria, again, a vulnerable country in terms of security threat. So those gaps need to be plugged in to make these conversations more viable in terms of creating that, as we call it, the network of corridors. I think that's where the conversation needs to head into, where you're talking to more and more countries, you're getting more and more countries part of this whole group, and create that cohesive coalition where we are able to ensure that while the political and the strategic initiative keeps its space, but at the same time, we're able to look into the practicalities of this corridor as well.
Thanks so much, Afak. It's a tall order for the IMEC governments, but I think clearly an imperative, and I really like this network of corridors approach that you were reiterating. John, I'd like to turn next to you. The Iran war has upended oil markets in particular and reinforced the need for alternative oil and gas pipelines, building on Saudi Arabia's own East-West pipeline. These pipelines weren't a major focus initially of IMEC, but I'm curious if you see an opportunity to integrate those pipelines into IMEC, and if there are any specific priority projects that you see in the wake of the war.
Right. I believe that in general, the crisis has created an opportunity. And I think that as we see the crisis unfolding, definitely infrastructure and connecting the dots between demand and supply will be very important. Now, moving beyond this, the East-West pipeline has received a lot of notoriety over the last six weeks, although in the 1980s, when it was first conceived and then constructed, by the late 1980s, it was opposed by some elements in Saudi Arabia, but it was a very novel plan, and we've seen now how it has come to use to alleviate some of the pressure. In some ways, I think you need to think how you're going to integrate and what will be the trade-offs between the inclusiveness of Saudi Arabia's ability to provide for the world and also the national interest it has to export oil molecules to the world, and at the same time facilitate towards using IMEC as an add-on, a value-add proposition to the stakeholder if it integrates itself and the pipeline through IMEC. It could very well say, I'm not interested because I get what I get because of my ability to invest. And the same goes for the UAE. The UAE could be deployed in some capacity to provide to the world, but then, what is out of it? And I'd like to add to this kind of thinking that the Gulf states, beyond IMEC, are also participating in this wider thinking about trade between the Gulf and China. And this concept of West Asia and China, to put it within the framework of Mohammed's excellent book. I would say that how do we perceive China in all of this? And how, as these Gulf states are trying to think of themselves within the East-West corridor, where is China placed and where is IMEC placed? And how do they see this as an inclusive approach rather than an exclusive approach? I think that will be interesting because remember, all of them have these relationships with China on a bilateral basis. And I think Afak made a very important point. I would refer to the GCC EU relationship. I don't think there is going to be a GCC EU free trade agreement. We have been talking about it for the last 25 years. What we are seeing is a bilateral agreement between certain EU states and GCC countries, but not as an entity within the GCC, but on a bilateral basis. So that puts into question how we're going to frame IMEC in this environment. So yes, Saudi Arabia could provide, but then the question will be, what do I get out of this? Because I'm being asked to, let's say, participate in the reconstruction of Syria. I'm being asked to participate in the reconstruction of Lebanon and at some point parts of Iraq. And if there is peace, I could participate also in Iran. But then what is it that I get? So I think the national interest is very much put into question as we think about IMEC, and very much so it's the price. Do I get more value add by going it alone, or do I get more out of it if I am part of an inclusive thinking that is defined in the terms of IMEC?
Thanks so much, John. Really interesting points. And I think also this question of the role of China, the IMEC was presented from Washington as an alternative explicitly to the Belt and Road Initiative in a way to make sure that China did not have a stranglehold on global supply routes through the Middle East. But I think this inclusivity point and from the perspective of the region, it demands a slightly more nuanced approach to the role of China in the corridor. Mohammed, I'd like to turn to you for one more question before I open it up to the audience for their questions. And again, just a reminder to our audience, please go ahead and submit your questions via askac.org. Mohammed, you spoke a little bit about this, but I'd like to delve in deeper. We've seen data centers being targeted in the Iran war, but we've also heard Gulf countries embracing advanced technology as part of their effort to diversify their economies away from the physical movement of goods, which obviously is vulnerable, as we've seen in the war. So I'm curious, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for the IMEC digital corridor coming out of this conflict, and how do they have to evolve?
Excellent question. Yeah. In my book, West Asia, I'm making the case that the Gulf is emerging separately as states, but collectively as a region, as a compute infrastructure backbone for emerging markets from South Asia to the Mediterranean Sea. And what I mean by compute, I mean the actual compute triangle that includes the semiconductors, the massive energy, the actual data center buildup, the latency question, meaning the source of compute and the servicing. And they have done a great job through building those sort of AI champions in the past few years. G42 in the UAE, I think 2018, Humane 2025, and Qatar AI, QAI for Qatar, also 2025. So those companies slash AI champions have been building this sort of compute infrastructure and offering the Gulf as a place that will be able to fill the deficit, the compute deficit that we need to service emerging markets. You are not going to service emerging markets from Texas or Virginia. You need nearby compute capacity source, and in this case, it is the GCC states. I think my thesis was unfortunately vindicated by the Iranian attacks on data centers in the UAE and Bahrain, because the Iranians do understand what's the meaning of this sort of post-oil transformation of the Gulf, local economy, source of revenue. And on top of that, when you build compute infrastructure, it has a spillover effect on your broader technological ecosystem, right? You're going to have specialized silicon, chip designing. You might even think about building legacy chips. You might think about building much more engineering specialization into building data centers that make those Gulf states not only building for themselves, but building for others, like the way that the Gulf states are working with the French, the Italians, the Greeks, and the Indians so far. So I was not surprised that they went after the data centers. I was not surprised that they classified data centers as part of this strategic, how they define a strategic infrastructure in the Gulf. And I think the message is, post-Iran war, that I don't believe that the Gulf states will let go of this AI ambitions. I believe they're going to double down. I think this will continue. We might discuss what's the security doctrine of AI infrastructure, absolutely. But the very idea that the Gulf states will stop investing or stop their own efforts in building this compute capacity, I don't believe this. I believe in this narrative. And the Gulf leaders I talk to keep confirming this. And this is no longer private conversations. This is public conversations. We are seeing those statements coming out of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Doha. And I think that will be the foundation for the day after. Different security doctrine. This is why I'm emphasizing the security aspect of it, like Afaq eloquently said, because you cannot go build these massive infrastructure and put all these massive investment without having an idea about what's the security architecture around that for the infrastructure itself, but the broader regional system.
Thanks so much, Mohammed. We have one question here, Afaq. I think you might be the best place to answer it, but others feel free to jump in. The question is, what do businesses gain by connecting their various projects to IMEC and the IMEC brand? Afaq, can you take that question? I think it's a really good one when you think about how big of an umbrella IMEC is and in how many different initiatives and projects could fit underneath that umbrella.
Yeah, I think one good thing that has happened, one of the many good things that has happened in the last couple of years, is the brand IMEC has been created across the world. I mean, it's becoming synonym with the connectivity corridors. So when we are talking in different parts of the world, we're talking about connectivity. Everyone says, oh, we want to be part of IMEC. I mean, what they actually mean is we want to be part of connectivity corridors, but they use the word IMEC. So that brand has been created. And now coming to the private sector or the businesses, one, it gives us multiple options to move cargo to trade energy. So that brings in the aspects of efficiency, that in terms of cost, in terms of time. So there are multiple options that are being discussed in the Middle East at this time, which they want to connect to IMEC. Like Bahrain, there is already cargo moving via Bahrain into Saudi, and then it follows the same path as IMEC follows into Haifa, which is already happening by road. So this gives more options to the private sector, to the businesses to move their cargo, because there's a lot of time-sensitive cargo that moves in this world. And when you're having contracts, when you're having these big contracts with big companies, there are penalties and then you don't really think about a $5,000 extra or a $4,000 extra being paying in a millions of billions of dollars of contracts in companies like Aramco and others. So this will always be balanced by the businesses. So that's what businesses gain. And the other aspect for businesses is when they're investing in building infrastructure. When the private sector gets involved in building infrastructure, there are returns that you can get out of it. And if you're able to offer those viable, efficient corridors for businesses around the world to move their cargo and energy, I think that gives them the returns on investments. And also creating, and in that, you're also creating a larger global new supply chains. You're creating new routes for the supply chain. You're creating new supply chains, which takes care of the vulnerabilities that exists in the global trade ecosystem. So I think that's where the businesses are going to benefit out of it. And just to add, let me say that the IMEC format is already happening in the Middle East, even before the war was happening, but through road. I mean, it was already happening. The cargo was already moving from Haifa to Jabal Ali and vice versa because it was moving because it made business sense. So they benefit out of it.
Thanks so much, Afaq. And I really like this idea, especially given the current instability and uncertainty of IMEC being an opportunity for governments to provide some greater certainty to the private sector of where they're committed to new infrastructure, new corridors, and where they're going to back up those private sector investments with a good enabling environment. John, we have another question. You spoke about the need for a unified Gulf approach to both IMEC and the region more broadly in the wake of the war. And we have a question about whether or not the Gulf countries are prepared to act in that unity following the Saudi UAE rift. Are you able to speak to that and where you see things going with that bilateral relationship?
Is going to unfold. And I wish and I hope that the two work closely together. When they look at this post-war GCC Middle East, these are the
John, I think we might be having some technical difficulties with you, but I appreciate your point on not letting the past dictate the future, and hopefully this can serve as a wake-up call for both capitals. While you resolve those technical issues, I want to provide another question, this time from Amit Yarom, who's asking, how has the war reshaped the political feasibility of IMEC across the region? Mohammed, would you like to take that question?
I mean, this is an excellent question. And he is absolutely right. The war will have an impact on the political calculus. And this is what I mean when I say you're going to have hybrid approaches. You're going to have collective approaches. You're going to have some states pursuing certain options that's much more viable for them. And this is why I said you're going to have emergence of other trade frameworks having side by side. So I think the Saudi pivot to the Red Sea / Saudi, Jordan, Syria is something that for people to keep an eye on. Keep an eye on Oman as the Indian Ocean anchor of the GCC that bypasses the Hormuz. Keep an eye on the UAE-India relationship post-Iran war. Those things are all true at the same time. I agree. Right now, clearly, we have decisions that are dictated by local sensitivities around some aspects of regional integration, and we cannot just say that those things are minor. They're not minor. They're not minor at all. And right now we are talking in April 2026. We're far away from the realities of the Delhi summit, G20 summit in Delhi, and the announcement of IMEC. It was Gaza. It was strikes on Doha, Iran war. Those things do matter and will have an impact on the psyche and the politics of a transcontinental integration project. This is absolutely a reality. However, and like Afaq said, remove the brand, remove the name, regional integration is taking shape. Like, I don't want us to be also fixated on a certain brand. I always say that, think about Quad. Quad started as a humanitarian framework of the coast of Indonesia in 2007, and it was the Japanese, at that time, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, working with the Americans, the Australians, and the Indians to come up with a framework. It became dormant for so many years until it was revived in 2017, 2018, and it became more of like a leaders level engagement framework. And this is the same thing I am telling people, that you should think about those frameworks the same way. They are unilateral, they're nimble, they're agile, they're going to adapt, they're going to reflect reality, but don't get fixated on what's happening today, because this framework could be revived in a year, because the different political realities will change. Also, you can have a much more organic buildup, bottom up, just based on the trade integration that's taking place organically based on their business relationship. So I know that this doesn't give like a very clear yes or no answer, because I don't believe there is a clear yes or no answer. It's much more sequential. It's more art than science right now. You're trying to manage the hated feelings around what has been happening in the region for the past 3 years, and that will have an impact on some major political decisions here.
I think those are all really important points, Mohammed, and it's a messy environment because there are so many countervailing both political and economic imperatives for regional integration at the same time that there are these major sensitivities and instability. And I think it's important, again, so much of this regional integration and this infrastructure that we're talking about are long-term initiatives, and that the pivots that you're talking about are long-term developments. And so it's hard to maintain kind of a focus on those long-term trends amid the breaking headlines of today, especially over the past few weeks. To a slightly more technical question, building on that point and the Saudi focus on the Red Sea, we have a question here about Netanyahu's comments about connecting Saudi Arabia's Red Sea oil terminals to Israel, and what it would take for Israel's EAPC pipeline to be integrated into the IMEC route. Afaq or John, if your technical issues are resolved, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, thank you. Apologies for this. And also to the excellent question posed earlier concerning the differences. I think this is an opportunity, a unique opportunity for the differences between some of the countries, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, to address and fix. If I'm a Kantian, I would say that this is feasible, it can be done. But if I'm a Machiavellian, I would say that the differences will continue to exist. And that's because of the competitiveness that both countries have about each other and within the wider and regional context. And these differences are much deeper. To what Mohammed said, I completely agree. So I think that is a challenge, and we have to see. It took a war between Germany and France to decide that they need to be united under the Iron and Steel Agreement in 1946-47. So I'm not so sure, but the war that we've just experienced for 6 weeks is a good example of how they should work together rather than apart. To the point about the pipeline connecting Israel to maybe a plan that connects it to Saudi Arabia, I think you need to have peace. And right now, there is no peace between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And Afaq referred to the final destination of IMEC, which is Haifa, on the Eastern Med before it goes into the Southern Med. That I think is aspirational at this point because Saudi Arabia has no treaty with Israel. So how are you going to connect a pipeline when there is no agreement? Of course, we could move ahead and create linkages of business and capital. You have Saudi companies that have invested in Israel. This is no secret, and plenty of publicity around that. And I think that could be one step forward. The other one will be the technicality of that. There are too many pipelines, and I think the cost. And one of the biggest challenge, if I may say so, of IMEC, is the participation of the private sector. Although this is a state initiative at the very top, the private sector needs to embrace this. And without the private sector participating in this, you're not going to have a flourishing IMEC in the coming years. So that is one of the most crucial challenges, in my opinion. You need to have forward and seize it as an opportunity. Otherwise, it's a theoretical, notional idea. Thank you.
Thanks, Johnny. I think it's a critical point that IMEC still needs much stronger private sector participation in the coordination process if it's going to be successful and realize the aspirations. And I also appreciate the reality check on where things stand between Saudi Arabia and Israel currently, and perhaps this incremental path forward that you describe. We have another question here, Afak, asking about the role of Egypt in IMEC. Could you address that question as it pertains to your thinking about the network of corridors?
Yeah, I think Egypt is another important country which could be made part of this whole network. I mean, if you go back when IMEC was announced, Egypt was one of the countries which did raise its concern of not being part of this corridor, or not being involved, as we know that most of the global trade moves via Suez Canal, and which is Egypt. And yes, there is, I mean, just to inform everyone that yes, I am at the moment writing a research paper at the Atlantic Council, which does look at the role of Egypt in the whole network of corridors. And there are opportunities where there are a few initiatives already being done, like Saudi-Egypt land bridge is in progress, and that would connect Saudi Arabia with Egypt and facilitate cargo movement into Egypt. And there are ports in Egypt which are on the Red Sea side, similar to what Saudi Arabia has, Jeddah Port, Neom Port. And from the Neom port, there are ferries which go across the Red Sea into Egypt, and Egypt is investing heavily in terms of developing the domestic railway network as well, which can move cargo from the ports in the Red Sea side towards the Mediterranean side, like Alexandria. Or the other option is also that you come to the Red Sea side of Saudi Arabia and move via Suez Canal. I mean, and that's already exists. You don't need to reinvent that. That already exists, and you can go via Suez Canal as well. So there is Bahrain, there is Oman, there is UAE. Get into Saudi Arabia from these three ports. One is inside the Strait of Hormuz, the other is outside. The Oman and ports are outside the Strait of Hormuz. Get onto these ports from there by road onto Saudi Arabia. Go to the Red Sea side, and then you can go to Egypt or via Suez Canal, or get into the Egypt, use the railway network, because we have roll-on, roll-off railway containers which can get onto the vessels. They have RO service, as we call it technically, and that also facilitates the movement of cargo, which reduces the transshipment and handling charges at the port. You just roll on, roll off, get onto the railway line, go to the Alexandria and into Europe. So it's a researching process for us also at the Atlantic Council, but there is a significant role that Egypt can play in this.
Thanks so much, Afak. John, we have another question about how we think the war might shape EU Gulf trade relations. I know you spoke before about your skepticism about a free trade agreement. Could you speak a little bit more to this question?
Yeah, I think that the free trade agreement is long gone. There's going to be no agreement. What we will see is bilateral agreements. So UAE, Saudi with the EU, and so forth. I think that this is a time to be thinking about this. This is a time to connect with Europe, as the Gulf will need to have partners, and they need to move beyond the Asia-centric approach, because out of this crisis, Asia is going to think very, very fast and very hard about diversifying away from dependency on oil. Their economies have been severely impacted short term because of this supply issue, the Strait of Hormuz being shut. So the EU is really at this important historic moment where they could be thinking and helping the Gulf diversify away in a post-oil future. So I think not directly an EU free trade agreement, but more about bilateral trade agreements is very much what I see happening.
I'd like to build on that because I think it's such an important point you make about the impact on Asian countries, India being one of them. And I'd love to hear both Afak and Mohammed, if you can speak to how you see Asian countries reacting to this conflict and if it could impact the trajectory of their trade relations with the Gulf.
If I may take this one, you will see more increasing trade networks that are going to take much more institutional aspect. So you have the GCC ASEAN summit, and I have been following this summit for quite some time. I think it doesn't get the media attention that it deserves. You have the GCC EU summit, and both of them are taking place around the same time. It's all post-Ukraine war. It's all post-Gaza, because they represent a different fundamental understanding of how the GCC thinks collectively and individually about where they are going when it comes to their trade aspirations. And I agree, you're going to have a hybrid model. You're going to have the Emiratis having their CEBAs, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and they have so many CEBAs with all over the globe. But you're also going to have GCC frameworks. I don't believe it will be up to the level of a trade agreement, but they will make sure that after this war, they're going to increase the relationship with certain Asian states. I think Korea will position itself very well as not only provider of technology as the country that built the nuclear program in the UAE, or the country that helped with a lot of the initiatives and defense platforms in the Gulf, but also as a country that stood up and provided air defense system in the UAE. The same thing will apply to Japan, especially under Prime Minister Takaishi and her support for the Gulf states during this war. You'll also have a different look into Indonesia, into Pakistan, that also played an interesting role. So you see the Pakistan-Thai relationship in a very interesting pace. The same thing applies to the UAE, India. So you're going to have collective approaches that sees ASEAN as a place that of importance for trade, but also going to have a lot of bilateral frameworks. I'm not sure I would use the word trade agreement to describe some of those engagements that will take a different and quicker pace in the day after the war with Iran.
Thanks so much, and for the good reminder for us to all be keeping an eye on the GCC and EU ASEAN summits coming up. Afak, you're sitting in New Delhi now. Can you speak a little bit more to the Indian perspective and how they might be adjusting in the wake of the war?
I think one important factor that plays a role for India's engagements with the Middle East will be the energy trade. We have a significant dependency on this region for our energies, and we have a huge population. We have a huge country, and our energy needs are really huge. So we'll have to balance that relationship with them. We cannot go off what we already have. So there is, yes, we are exploring our options in terms of energy sourcing. We are looking at different options also, and our energy portfolio in terms of the countries from where we're importing has changed in the last few weeks, and especially with the sanctions on Russia. So we have increased our imports from Russia as well. But at the same time, the GCC has been critical partner for India. As I mentioned, we already have SEPA with Oman, with UAE, and there are some really big targets of our trade engagements with them. Yes, war has changed it a bit, but energy would keep us tied. Our strategic relevance, strategic importance of GCC for India would always remain. And one important thing for us as India is there's a huge Indian diaspora in the region. And that has an economic as well as a social impact on the relationship between the two countries. I mean, there's a huge relevance that the diaspora brings in, whether it's a cultural or an economic in terms of the remittances that it's a huge number. So the relationship with GCC is really important and critical. And also, if you see, the government of India has already announced our foreign minister is going to be in UAE, I think on tomorrow or day after. So which shows that it is a critical partner for India, for multiple reasons, which I said.
Thanks so much, Afak, and to all of you. We're unfortunately now at time, but I think this has been a really rich conversation and really just reiterating the importance of embracing not just strategic redundancy, but regional integration, whether it's under IMEC or other smaller, more agile umbrellas in the wake of this war. So I thank you, you all for your time, our panelists and our audience, and we look forward to continuing this conversation at the Atlantic Council on Middle East connectivity and integration under IMEC and other rubrics.
Thank you, Allison.